Hawks on the Wire is a podcast produced by Three Hawks Haven, an e-card company where love, kindness, and connection are designed in each e-card. The story you're about to hear, shared by Joan's guest, will be a story from someone's life, their personal experience. By learning from stories just like this, Three Hawks Haven is able to create beautiful and moving e-cards that can really touch someone's heart. In times of celebration or in the tougher times of life, Three Hawks Haven has e-cards for most any occasion, including some you just can't find anywhere else. You can shop for all their e-cards by going to their website, threehawkshaven.com. Now to Hawks on the Wire with your host, Joan.
Hi, my name is Joan, and I am your host for Hawks on the Wire, a podcast brought to you by threehawkshaven.com. Today we are talking to Susan, and Susan is going to discuss with us the challenges she faced as a caregiver for her husband Mike in the last few years of his life. She discovered also that actually her horses helped her with her own grief and stress. And then she found Equine Gestalt Therapy. And Susan is now a certified Equine Gestalt Coach, and she and her horses help Susan's clients find their own emotional healing. The name of her business is Connection and Synergy. Hi, Susan. How are you doing today, beautiful lady?
I'm fabulous, Joan.
Good. I love that. And what would you like to share with us a little bit about yourself to our listeners?
Well, my name's Susan Bloom. I grew up in a really small town in western Kansas where I still live. I was the only daughter of the only doctor in town from the time I was 8 years old until I was about 18. And so I've seen a little bit about that side of healthcare. I worked in his office some when I was a young adult and a teenager. And I was a caregiver for my husband for 5.5 years. He had started with an autoimmune disease and then had numerous complications, very complicated case. And during that time, I started the Equine Gestalt Coaching Program, which helped set me up emotionally. The work that I did with the horses and in that program set me up emotionally for what came next. I was diagnosed with breast cancer in early November of 2017. And my husband passed away dramatically in June of 2018, June 28th of 2018. And I would say that I was set up emotionally the best I could have been because of the Equine Gestalt coaching and the work that I did in that program. I'm currently deepening my Gestalt work, and I'm in the kind of a second phase of the training. Optional phase. It's called just Gestalt coaching method. And I'm just over halfway through that course. So I am ready and available. I'd like to help doctors, caregivers, any sort of medical professionals and patients on their journeys with equine Gestalt or Gestalt coaching.
Very good. You had told me that, connecting sometimes the doctor, the medical language at times was hard to understand when you were like the caregiver and your husband and you would go to the doctor's appointments. And that could be very frustrating, huh?
It can be. And I found for years through my work with horses that I talked to vets a little bit better. I also would sometimes take questions to my dad about what does this mean? What are they saying? Because vets can be kind of the same way. But doctors do tend to get in there. Well, we all have our own lingo for our own businesses.
Right.
We'll just put it that way. Engineers have engineer speak, and doctors definitely have doctor speak. And sometimes you have to ask them. And I really feel like the more connection you feel with that doctor, the easier it is to ask them those questions, ask them to explain, as well as sometimes you have to ask them some kind of hard questions.
Mm-hmm. So you need to be in the position where you trust your doctor enough to ask those hard questions. You need to get there where you're able to ask them, correct?
Definitely. Definitely. And I like to say I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly in healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, the ugliest I saw was here locally. And there was just one doctor who I felt was really condescending to my husband. I didn't ever call him out on it, but it certainly didn't make me want to go back and see him.
Right. Exactly. And your husband, you were his caregiver, you said, for about 5 years.
5.5.
5.5 years. And would you like to tell us, the story you were telling me about? It was towards the end of Mike. Mike was your husband's name, in the end of his life, and he was had to have the stat flight come and take him to the hospital.
So he'd been, Tuesday night, I took him to the ER because he was in a lot of pain. And actually, the ER provider, he was either a PA or a nurse practitioner, was going to send him home. And I looked at Mike's oxygen saturation and said, this is quite a bit lower than he normally is. And he said, oh, it is? And I said, yeah, it is, like 10 points lower than he normally is. And then Mike spiked a temp, so they automatically kept him there in the hospital. The next day was my last chemo treatment. So I had my dad take me to Hayes for chemo, which is 90 miles. And I came home and went over to the hospital to check in on Mike. And I mean, he seemed okay. He was grumpy. His PICC line was plugged and he was grumpy. And he said, I'll be home Saturday or Sunday, as soon as they finish these antibiotics. And I think they were talking about replacing the PICC line too. And so I went on and did my Wednesday stuff. And the next morning I was getting ready to go over and see him. And the hospital called and said, he started having trouble breathing at 2 or 3 this morning. He wouldn't let us call you. And we put him on BiPAP, and that seemed to work. And about 6 or 7 this morning, he started having more trouble, and he's intubated now. And we're calling the air ambulance to take him to Kansas City.
Mm.
So you have about 40 minutes to get here.
Oh, wow.
And I said, well, would it be better for me to drive so I have something to drive in Kansas City? And she said, well, that's up to you.
Mm-hmm.
But you have 40 minutes to get over here if you want to go on the flight with him. So I had one of my sons take me over there so I didn't have to leave my car at the hospital parking lot. And
what were you thinking then? It had to have been like, oh my gosh.
Well, they had actually flown him to Kansas City. This was the end of June, and so the 1st of May. So I guess it probably didn't really hit me until I got there and saw, he's in the ICU, he's intubated. Of course, he was sedated, highly sedated.
And for our listeners, intubated, we mean that he was on a breathing machine. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's all good.
So I stood there at the hospital for an hour watching them try to stabilize him before the flight crew got there.
Okay.
And then for another hour after the flight crew got there, they worked on stabilizing him and finally took us out to the airport in the ambulance. And we had not even reached cruising altitude when his heart monitor flatlined. It was just like you see on TV.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sitting there in the passenger seat, and I felt so helpless. I wanted to help, but there wasn't anything I could do. They got his heartbeat back.
So powerless for you.
It was a really powerless feeling, and I can remember just trying to make myself smaller and to get out of their way. So the pilot rerouted us to Hayes instead of Kansas City. Hayes is 90 miles. Kansas City's 350 from here. And from the airport at Hayes, of course, they put us in an ambulance and took us to the hospital. And they met me at the door. The chaplain met me at the door and took me to not just the waiting room, but a private waiting room.
Oh, wow.
So I knew the situation was dire. I called my dad to tell him what was happening, and before I hardly even got that out, the doctor had come in, and I knew at that point that there had been nothing that they could do. He said they'd gotten his heartbeat back twice on the plane, but he was gone. So that sets off a whole another set of fun circumstances.
Yes, a lot of grief for you, and high trauma too. High trauma for something like that to come down that way.
Well, I didn't realize how much trauma it was until about 6 months later. I drove by the hospital and I felt it in my whole body. And so that was in January. And then in September, I went with a friend to see a classmate who was in that hospital. And when we pulled in the parking lot, I felt it again.
Yes.
And last February, and I thought I was over all that stuff. And last February, I walked by the ICU unit at the hospital where he started. And I was going to a secondary ultrasound room, which was just a hospital patient room. And I think the poor little tech thought she was going to lose me.
Oh, would you say you were ready to pass out, or?
It's kind of how it felt. Yeah.
Well, now this is the part of your story that just really fascinates me, because it brings us to your horses and how, with the equine gestalt method, this time with you and Mike, I mean, that's a few years and the high trauma, but you were already learning the coaching to work with the horses for healing, to help you take care of yourself. Correct?
I actually graduated from the program about 5 weeks before Mike died.
Okay.
And it did. I mean, it truly set me up to be in the best emotional place I could be. And not that I haven't done work around what's happened since then.
Right.
But,
takes time. It takes
it
a lot.
does.
So, can you tell us? I love your story where you decided another equine coach got you on the telephone and she was going to help you, I guess, part of the healing process, this grief about Mike, and she was going to help you with your horses.
Yeah. Of course, we're in, this pandemic, and this was this spring.
Okay.
And we weren't really, I mean, some people were practicing, but mostly that was in May, so people were being pretty careful. And my dad had been diagnosed with colon cancer that had metastasized, and I called, this gal had offered to do this piece for me over the phone, and I set it up with her, and I said, I need to do this sooner rather than later because I'm afraid I'm going to have more grief.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I went out to my pasture, which is a small pasture on the edge of town. And there's a highway that's really close. So I could hear the cars and trucks going by. And I'm sure people drove by on the street that goes right by there and wondered what I was doing out there with the horses. I don't remember seeing any or hearing any. Fortunately, no one stopped.
Yes. Yes, because you were in a process.
Yeah, I was. So the horses were confused because I don't normally come out that time of day, and I normally wouldn't put someone in with all four horses.
So you were in the field with 4 horses. And what's their names?
Well, they all have registered names. I have one that I call Sassy, one that I call Minnie, and the other two kind of go back and forth between sister and something, just because I don't have barn names for them. They do all have registered names because they're all registered horses.
Okay.
So I was out there with the four mares, and they were kind of gathered around me. I have one who's a little bit more timid. She's not been handled as much as the other 3, so she kind of stands back and watches. And Daylin, who was the coach leading me through the grief piece, we were on Zoom, and she was at the barn with her horses as well to help her. So she started asking me, about Mike, about our marriage, and the horses were all there to support me.
Mm-hmm.
And like every marriage, it wasn't perfect, and I have regrets, and we went through some of those, and we went through some apologizing, some things that I was sorry for. And at one point, I don't remember exactly when it was, Sassy took her head and put it on my shoulder and lined her throat up with mine because I was having trouble getting words out.
Oh.
And so
she understood.
She did, and she was supporting me with my throat chakra and trying to get those words out. And then we go through, things that we're thankful for and things that we'll always remember.
Mm-hmm. Memories. You're going through some memories.
Yeah. The things that I will always take with me from we were married for 32 years. I was 22 when we got married. So fairly young. And then the 2 older mares, Sassy and Minnie, one of them got on each side of me. They backed up to me.
They backed up, like they backed their hindquarters up
Yes.
to your backside.
Well, actually, one was on one shoulder and the other on the other shoulder.
Okay.
So that is to support my foundation, my root chakra, and my foundation is what they were doing.
Yes. They were grounding you, supporting you.
They were. And when they felt like I was finished, they meandered back out into the field and started grazing.
Oh, that's wonderful. How did you feel when you had, of course, I know your horses, you trust them, you love them, but horses are big beings. And so you had these 2 big beings, one on left shoulder, one on the right shoulder. and I'm sure it was all good. How did you feel?
Well, again, like you said, I know them, and I know that Sassy tends to like to get really close. And sometimes it's too much. And so I would, with someone else with them, I would, that's why I say I would never put someone in with all four of them.
Mm-hmm.
Unless I knew them.
Excuse me, is it usually one-on-one, Susan?
It usually is, yeah, usually one-on-one in a round pen or a field. Some people do a in a field with a few horses, but and a lot of times just one of them will come up. There was, Sassy, who she almost always, if I would stay out there, would almost always work on me, and was even before I knew what she was doing.
She understood it before you understood it.
Oh, they all do. It's what they do.
Very healing beings. Very healing. When you have a guest come and for the healing from your horses, do you pick the horse, or how do you do that?
The horse will tell you that it wants to work at that point. So yeah, basically I do.
And you're listening to your horse. So in a way, the horse is raising his hand, his hoof, and saying, "I want to help."
Right. Exactly.
Well, that's fascinating.
And it is. It is fascinating, and it's magical.
I believe it. I can tell by your face, and you have a passion for it.
Yes, I do. Well, I have a passion for horses in general.
Yes, they're marvelous beings.
They are.
Well, it's just, I love that story, and I'm hoping our listeners can really, visualize you out in that field and the cars going by and these four horses, loving on you and healing you and being there for you. That's got to be a powerful feeling, just knowing how supportive they are.
It is. And, there was another time, and this was earlier on, when Mike had seen the surgeon early in the morning in Kansas City, and we drove home, and it had been kind of a rough drive home. But the surgeon hadn't been in to see Mike before Mike had several EGDs and dilations, and that's what this was. And he hadn't been in to see Mike beforehand. And when he came out, we'd been talking about a surgery. Mike had gotten too sick to have a major surgery. Mike had gotten too sick to have it. And that was in January, and this was in August. And I asked him, I said, so when can we look at doing that surgery again? And he said, oh, I think that's off the table now. And it just crushed me. And it crushed me that I knew that he didn't tell Mike that.
Oh.
And I felt like he expected me to.
Oh, yes.
And I didn't like that position. And this is a surgeon that I really do. I mean, I have a lot of respect for him, and I really do like him. And it just didn't feel right. And so I drove 350 miles home, and thinking about that all the way home. And when I got home, I took a short nap and went out to feed. And so it was late. It was kind of late when I got out to feed that night, and it was dark. And I fed, and I always, especially if it's really hot or really cold, I always check their water. They have automatic waterers. And so I went out in the pen to check their water. And the three of the mares came and gathered around me. And so I waited while Sassy went to check all of the feeders to make sure there wasn't any food in them.
I love that.
And then she came over, and it was as if she dismissed them.
Oh.
And said, "This is my job. Thank you. I'll take care of her. But thank you for keeping her here."
Yes.
And again, she worked on my throat chakra. Um, to which I told her, I said, I know I've got something to say. I just need to figure out the words and how to say it and who I need to say it to.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up having a conversation with the doctor then later on the phone, and we kind of worked things out. But they're amazing creatures.
Yeah, Sassy really did help you with that through
And
that process.
she did a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even if I didn't go in the pen, sometimes she would she would like say, "Come over here." Well, and one day this winter, I I drove out there. It was during that really cold snap. So I drove out to feed, and a song that reminded me of Mike came on the radio just shortly before I got there. So I thought, well, I'm just going to sit here and listen to it. And I could see her. They were all kind of standing there at the gate. And I watched as she did what we call leeching, which is pulling energy off of us and releasing it back into the universe.
How can you tell that? Do they assume some sort of posture or?
Yeah, it's kind of like yawning.
Oh,
And my massage therapist yoga instructor tells me that when we yawn, it's a release of energy as well.
that makes sense.
So they do the same thing for us. Um, and she was doing it from several feet away and through the car.
Mm-hmm. She knew that this needed to be done.
She did. Yeah.
Well, I have just fallen in love with your beautiful healing horses. I just love these stories. They're just wonderful.
Thank you.
Yes, I know that, obviously they were such a support base for you. I think your dad was too.
He was, yeah.
And I did want to ask you, what would you tell Susan now, now that you've been through this, and you step back a few years, and if you would obviously you would still have your wonderful magical horses, but what would you tell Susan or other caregivers when they're going through this process of caring for another person and talking with doctors and maybe not understanding everything that is said?
You need to think of your doctors. And I think that's where I had an advantage. Because my dad was, like I said, the doctor out here in Western Kansas, which in the 70s was considered frontier medicine. I'm not sure if it still falls in that category. But he also took medical students from KU Med Center. So I grew up around doctors, medical students, and they were just people to me, which is also kind of in my life, that's how my parents kind of brought me up, that everyone is just another person. They're not, just because they have, thus and such education or not,
Right,
doesn't make them any less of a person.
right.
So people need to, and that's where I think the connection comes in, connection with your doctors, with your healthcare team, in that doctors make mistakes just like the rest of us. And the better connection you have with them, first of all, the better you can accept that. And secondly, the better connection you have with them, the easier it is to ask some of those hard questions. Mike had a pulmonologist, and I would get frustrated and say, one of the last times that we were in the hospital, he was in the hospital at KU. I said, it feels like you guys don't talk to each other, because he saw 4 doctors regularly at KU Med Center, and then some other ones kind of more sporadically. I said, it just feels like you guys don't talk to each other. And it's very frustrating for me to come in and and feel that way. And he said, in no uncertain terms, he said, we do communicate. It's not the way you might hope, but I read every single note from every single doctor he's seen before I see him every time. And he said, we're frustrated too. This is a very complicated case. I mean,
Absolutely.
he just was, but if I had not had a connection with him, I might not have been able to ask that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then another one of his doctors says, I always thought that they had, I wasn't sure they had the right autoimmune disease diagnosed. And I think I asked the rheumatologist more than once, I said, I'm not sure that's the correct diagnosis. And he said, yes, that is a correct diagnosis, because it was one of those rule out ones. It wasn't something you could test for.
It was very rare, you said.
Yeah, it was very rare. And when we went to Mayo Clinic, they said they had only seen less than 500 cases of that autoimmune disease of the 7 million patients that they had seen.
Wow.
And he said, yes, I believe we have that one diagnosed correctly. There may be something else going on that we just don't know about. And he had a stricture in his esophagus, which caused him not to be able to eat. And I always thought it was caused by the autoimmune process, but they would say, no, that's not part of it. Well, then why does he have this? And no one could answer that for me.
Mm-hmm.
So what would I tell other people? You need to take care of yourself. As a caregiver, you need to take care of yourself. And we hear that all the time. And because people don't see what we're doing that is taking care of ourselves. You know, for me, it was going out and feeding the horses twice a day.
Right.
When I was home, or when Mike was in the hospital at KU Med Center, I did not stay in the hospital with him. Our son was in Lawrence, about 40 miles away. And I would drive over there in the evenings, have dinner with him if he was available. If not, I'd get dinner somewhere and have a glass of wine and sleep in a real bed.
Mm-hmm.
And
mm-hmm. You were taking care of yourself.
And drive back in the morning. Mm-hmm. Before, usually before the sun rose, because I wanted to avoid traffic, and I wanted to get there before the surgeons tended to come around at about 6:30 in the morning.
And you wanted to speak with them.
I did. I wanted to hear what they had to say. I wanted to see what was going on that day. Exactly. Again, when I was home, and what people saw was probably different than what I felt. When I was home, going out and feeding the horses, and Mike would make it so that I could go to, I went in 2.5 years, I guess, I went to 9 weekend long workshops for the Equine Gestalt coaching program. And he always made sure that I could go. One time I came back and he told me that he'd been in the hospital overnight while I was gone, which upset me to no end. But he was right. There wouldn't have been anything I could have done.
Yes, he knew how important that was to you. And he wanted to help you take care of yourself.
Yes, he did. And so those are the things that people don't see as taking care of yourself. We still had one son who was in high school, and together we'd go to his activities. And if he didn't go when we were home, if he didn't go, he always made it so I could.
Again, it was important.
And it was important to me. And that's, family is very important to me. And he knew that.
Right.
And that may not look like taking care of myself, but it was how that felt to me.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense to me, because when family is important to you, you want to be around them and you want to be involved in their life.
And one of the ways that as a caregiver you can take care of yourself is setting those boundaries. I had class every Tuesday night on the phone, and I would say, this is my time to do this. I've got to do this. Occasionally I did that in the hospital. Occasionally I did that when we were driving to the hospital. But I made sure that I was there every week, almost every week.
I admire your perseverance with that, how you stuck with that commitment. Very good. And the horses so well. I would love to podcast the horses, but what would you say the horses would tell caregivers if they could speak people language? What would they tell us?
I think they'd say the same thing. Don't let yourself get so depleted that you can't give back. And not only as caregivers, I mean, as whoever you are, don't let yourself even if you're an engineer, don't let yourself get so depleted by work that your family is coming in third or fourth, or because you can't. People can't give from an empty cup.
Right. Very good. Any career, you want to not get burnout. You want to be able to have time for your family and other important people. And the horses understand that. That's wonderful advice. Well, anything else you would like to add, Susan?
Well, here's another thing, and this was from the surgeon that I was talking about earlier. I think it was the hospital stay where they put Mike's feeding tube in. And Mike was being particularly hard to deal with, hard-headed. They said they'd let him out that day, and then he wouldn't do what they wanted him to do. So we had to spend another day. And I was pretty frustrated with him, and I was headed down to the gift shop to see if there was any dark chocolate. And the surgeon stopped me in the lobby, asked me how I was doing. And I said something about Mike being really stubborn. And he said, yes, I understand he's being kind of ornery today. And then he said to me, he said, when you get home, you need to call your girlfriends and go out and basically just get away from it for a while. And I said to him, I said, well, I don't have any friends that are that close that I would feel comfortable doing that. And he said, then get on the phone with them.
There you go.
And so that would be something else that I would say, to take care of yourself. Take yourself out of that caregiving situation, even if it's for an evening.
Very good.
Depending on the amount of caregiving you're doing, you might have to hire someone to help out, or ask someone to help out.
Yes.
But do it to take care of yourself.
And make that connection with some other people in your life.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. That's a great story. I love that surgeon, he cared enough about you too, to, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. He's the one who I emailed two of Mike's doctors right after I was diagnosed with breast cancer and said, so what would you do for your wife or daughter? And he recommended a surgeon there at KU, and the next time we came for an EGD, he's the one who did the EGDs. When he came out to talk to me, the first thing he said, the first thing he did was asked about me.
Did he really?
He did, yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, Susan, I really appreciate your time today. You're an amazing lady. You've been through so much, and you are just doing so much with your life and giving back.
Thank you.
Yes. And thank you for your time with Hawks on the Wire today.
You're welcome.
You tell your beautiful horses that the Hawks said hello.
Okay, I will.
Maybe we'll be down one day to meet them. I would love that.
Well, it would be fun. And if anyone would like to learn more about me and the Gestalt coaching method, my website is connectionandsynergy.com.
Very good. Thank you. And I want to thank our listeners too for listening to Susan and her magical horses and the healing that they do. We do have a tip on 3 Hawks Haven. We do have e-cards for caregivers. We have a couple of e-cards that have horse lovers. So if you have time, visit our website, 3hawkshaven.com. And I want to thank our dear listeners for joining us again and sharing your time. If you have a story you would like to share with the Hawks, please go to our website, go to the page Hawks on a Wire, and submit the form. I would love to hear from you. And remember, when we share our humanity, we share the possibility to heal. Thank you.